Did you know that some of rock's biggest legends didn't just change music, they lived on the edge until it consumed them? From Jimi Hendrix's electrifying guitar skills to Amy Winehouse's hauntingly soulful voice. Here are the 25 worst substance addicts in rock and roll history. Jimi Hendrix didn't just play the guitar. He turned it into something otherworldly, bending sounds in ways no one thought possible. He redefined the instrument, creating sounds that nobody had heard before, using distortion and feedback like tools in his own personal sonic workshop. But behind the genius was a man who drowned himself in a cocktail of substances and reckless habits. He was rarely seen without LSD or amphetamines coursing through his system, making his world a blurred, chaotic mess of creativity and destruction. The deeper he sank, the more erratic he became, his performances fluctuating between moments of brilliance and disasters fueled by intoxication. Those close to him tried to intervene, but the downward spiral was unstoppable. In 1970, at only 27, he was found unconscious in a London apartment, having suffocated on his own vomit after a lethal mix of barbiturates. His death, a sudden and tragic end to a career that had barely begun, sent shockwaves through the music industry. Janis Joplin didn't just sing, she tore her heart out and threw it into every note. Her voice was raw, cracked with emotion, drenched in pain, and impossible to ignore. She wasn't just another rock star, she was a force, an explosion of energy that could shake an entire room. But for all the fire she had on stage, there was something much darker lurking beneath. A childhood filled with rejection and self-doubt left wounds she never quite healed from, and by the time she was a star, alcohol had become her closest confidants. She could be magnetic one moment and completely self-destructive the next. Her vices consumed her, and the harder she tried to drown her demons, the stronger they became. By 1970, she was another casualty of excess, found lifeless in a hotel room with a needle by her side. At 27, she had reached the top and crashed back down with brutal finality. Did she burn too bright? Or was she just another victim of the world that made her famous? 3. Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison didn't live life. He devoured it. He was more than just the frontman of The Doors. He was a poet, a madman, a visionary wrapped in self-destruction. His words painted pictures of rebellion, of pushing past the limits society imposed, but he took that philosophy beyond the music. Substances and alcohol weren't just recreational for him. They were a way of life, a tool to break open the doors of perception. He stumbled through existence in a haze of intoxication, leaving a trail of chaos wherever he went. Legal troubles followed him, relationships suffered, and even his bandmates struggled to keep up. His health deteriorated rapidly, and by the time he escaped to Paris in 1971, he was barely a shadow of the man he had been. When he was found dead in a bathtub, the official cause was heart failure, but those who knew his habits suspected otherwise. No autopsy was performed, leaving his death forever shrouded in speculation. Did he find the freedom he was searching for, or did he simply get lost in his own destruction? 4. Keith Moon. Keith Moon wasn't just a drummer. He was a human hurricane. His performances were pure chaos, full of wild energy and explosive power, but his life off stage was even more destructive. He lived fast, played hard, and made sure no party ever ended too soon. Hotel rooms were demolished, cars were wrecked, and no rule was ever left unbroken. Moon wasn't just drinking and using substances for fun. He was consuming them like they were the only thing keeping him alive. His antics became legendary, but the damage was undeniable. By the time The Who reached their peak, Moon's playing was suffering, his once unstoppable force dulled by constant intoxication. His bandmates watched helplessly as he spiraled, trying to pull him back from the edge, but it was never enough. In 1978, the end came not with a bang, but a whisper, a quiet, lonely overdose on a medication meant to help him stop drinking. He was only 32, a man who had spent his entire life chasing chaos, only to be undone by the very thing he loved most. Sid Vicious was punk rock personified, loud, reckless, and doomed from the start. He couldn't really play the bass, but that didn't matter. His image, his attitude, his complete disregard for everything made him a legend. But punk wasn't just a style for Sid. It was a death sentence. Illegal substances ran through his veins more consistently than blood, and his relationship with Nancy Spungen only dragged him further into oblivion. The two were inseparable, bound by their love of chaos and destruction. When Nancy was found dead in a hotel room, stabbed in the stomach, Sid was the only suspect. But before he could stand trial, substances claimed him, too. In 1979, at just 21, he was found lifeless in a New York apartment, the punk rock dream, reduced to a tragic cliché. 6. Kurt Cobain. Kurt Cobain didn't sign up for the rock star life. He wanted to make music, not be turned into an icon, and definitely not deal with the machine that chewed him up and spat him out. The fame, the pressure, the expectations. He hated it all. Illegal substances dulled the noise, numbed the weight of it, but it was never a solution, just a slow-burning escape. The world saw him as a legend. He saw himself as a man barely holding on. He tried to fight his addiction, going to rehab and attempting to clean up, but every time it pulled him back under. Nirvana was unstoppable, but Cobain was breaking apart. His body was on autopilot, playing shows, smiling in interviews. But his mind was somewhere else, somewhere darker, where the noise finally stopped. By 1994, he was done. A shotgun, a lethal dose of something, and a note that no one could ever really make sense of. His death wasn't a shock to those who knew him. It was more like the final page of a story that had been heading toward an inevitable end. 7. Lane Staley. Lane Staley didn't just sing about pain. He lived it. His voice was raw, haunted, dripping with the kind of sorrow that only comes from knowing there's no way out. He knew he was dying long before his body caught up, watching himself waste away in slow motion. Alice in Chains fell silent as he locked himself away, awful things pulling him further and further into the abyss. His friends tried to help, but he pushed them away. He didn't want anyone seeing what he had become. His body grew frail, his voice barely a whisper, his presence almost non-existent. It was just him, his addiction, and a growing emptiness that no song could ever fill. By 2002, he was gone, alone in his apartment, nothing left but the substances and the decay of a life that could have been so much more. He was 34, and the world barely noticed until weeks later, when the smell of death finally forced someone to check on him. 8. Scott Weiland. Scott Weiland had all the talent in the world, but addiction made sure he never really got to enjoy it. Stone Temple Pilots, Velvet Revolver. He built empires, and then he burned them down. Rehab, relapses, arrests. It was the same vicious cycle on repeat. The substances didn't just take his health, they took his reputation. The industry grew tired of his unpredictability. His bandmates grew exhausted from cleaning up his messes, and fans watched in frustration as one of the greatest voices of his generation drowned himself in excess. He tried to fight it, but the substances always found a way back in, stealing every second chance he was given. He was kicked out of his own band more than once, forced to face the fact that his talent wasn't enough to keep people around. By 2015, his body just gave up. A lonely tour bus, a final overdose, and another rock legend who never got to outrun his demons. He was 48, and the only thing left was a legacy of incredible music and an endless list of what-ifs. 9. Amy Winehouse. Amy Winehouse wasn't just a singer. She was a force of nature, a voice that could cut through any noise. But her pain was louder. Fame didn't save her. It swallowed her whole, feeding off her struggles, turning every fall into a headline. The substances, the alcohol, the toxic relationships, she was drowning, and the world just watched. Rehab wasn't enough. She'd clean up, fall back, try again, and spiral even harder. Her body couldn't keep up with the chaos, and neither could her mind. By 2011, her body had enough. 27 years old, gone from alcohol poisoning, leaving behind music that still echoes long after she's left the stage. Nikki Sixx should have died a dozen times. He lived fast, played harder, and pushed the limits of what a human body can survive. He consumed whatever he could get his hands on. He didn't just party, he obliterated himself. Clinically dead for 2 minutes from an overdose, he somehow clawed his way back. Paramedics brought him back to life, and instead of taking it as a warning, he used it as a badge of honor. His addiction fueled his music, his reckless behavior, his every decision. He was untouchable until he wasn't. The substances tried to take him, but he wrote his own ending instead. Sobriety didn't come easy, but he made it, turning his hellish past into the Heroin Diaries, a survival guide wrapped in a warning. 11. Steven Tyler. Steven Tyler had it all: charisma, talent, and a reckless addiction that nearly cost him everything. He wasn't picky, just desperate to keep the chaos going. His bandmates staged an intervention when they couldn't take it anymore, forcing him to face what he'd been running from. It took years, relapses, and near disasters, but he finally got clean. Aerosmith survived the mess, and so did he. Not everyone gets a second act, but somehow Tyler did. 12. Slash. Slash made his guitar scream, but offstage it was the substances that had him by the throat. Illegal substances, booze. It was all part of the lifestyle, or at least that's what he told himself. Then his heart nearly gave out, his body refusing to keep up with the punishment. Cardiomyopathy put a clock on his life, forcing him to make a choice: clean up or die young. He picked survival, barely. Now he plays without the poison, proving that some legends don't burn out, they rise from the ashes. 14. Jerry Garcia. Jerry Garcia wasn't just the heart of the Grateful Dead, he was also a ticking time bomb. His love for illegal substances and other vices dragged him down, body and soul, to a place no legend should go. While the fans saw a free-spirited icon, Garcia was watching himself slip further into something he could no longer escape. Rehab came and went, his health crumbled, but the music never stopped, not until it had no choice. He was stuck in an endless cycle, trying to shake off something that had already sunk too deep. By the time 1995 rolled around, his body called it quits. A heart attack in rehab, the kind of tragic ending that felt written in stone long before it happened. The music lived on, but a huge piece of rock history was buried with him. The weight of his addiction had been a shadow over him for decades, and in the end, it won. The battle was over, but the legacy remained, a bittersweet reminder of talent lost to self-destruction. 15. David Bowie. David Bowie was larger than life, but during the 70s, he was also barely hanging on. The man was drowning in illegal substances, his body withering away, his mind playing cruel tricks on him. He locked himself away, feeding on a diet of red peppers, milk, and narcotics, because apparently basic nutrition was too much to ask for. Paranoia gripped him, his health took a nosedive, and for a while it seemed like even his genius couldn't pull him back. He was running from himself, losing pieces of who he was with every hit. But Bowie wasn't just another addict spiraling toward disaster. He clawed his way out and reinvented himself, turning his near collapse into a rebirth. The comeback? Legendary. The cost? Almost everything. The difference between him and many others on this list was simple. He escaped. Not unscathed, not without scars, but he got out. He lived long enough to see himself evolve, to become more than just the ghost of his past excesses. And for that, he remains one of the greatest. Anthony Kiedis had no chance. His own father handed him his first taste of destruction before he was even old enough to understand what it meant. From then on, it was a never-ending war against addiction that threw him off track time and time again. The Red Hot Chili Peppers rode his highs and crashed with his lows. Sobriety wasn't a straight road. It was a winding, messy disaster filled with relapses and regret. He fell back into old habits, dragging his band through chaos, his own body suffering the consequences. But somehow, he got there. Eventually, he found a way to stay clean, and that's the only reason the Chili Peppers are still standing today. Without sobriety, there would be no band, no legacy, no music left to salvage. His fight was ugly, relentless, but he survived. And in the world of rock and roll, that alone is an achievement. 17. Iggy Pop. Iggy Pop turned self-destruction into performance art. Wild, unhinged, and completely reckless, he wasn't just about pushing boundaries, he was about obliterating them. His love affair with illegal substances nearly wiped out his career before it even had the chance to cement itself. The Stooges collapsed under the weight of his addiction, and his body paid the price. Withdrawal hit him hard, and at one point, his substance-fueled chaos landed him in a mental institution. But just when it seemed like he was destined for a tragic end, along came David Bowie, throwing him a lifeline. Iggy grabbed it, climbed out of the abyss, and somehow, against all logic, made it to legendary status. He didn't just survive, he thrived. His career had a second act, something so few addicts ever get. And yet, he remains a reminder of just how close the edge always is. 18. Brian Jones. Brian Jones was a genius, but genius doesn't save you when addiction has its claws in deep. He helped shape the Rolling Stones, yet substances and alcohol turned him into the band's biggest problem. Unreliable, erratic, and spiraling out of control, he missed sessions, skipped gigs, and alienated himself from the very group he built. By the time 1969 rolled around, the Stones had no choice but to kick him out. A few weeks later, he was floating lifeless in his own swimming pool. He was 27, another rock star gone too soon, another example of how fame and addiction go hand in hand. His death wasn't shocking. It was the end of a story that had been writing itself for years. The signs were all there, flashing like neon warnings, but no one could stop what was coming. His brilliance wasn't enough to outweigh his demons, and in the end, they won. 19. John Bonham. John Bonham played the drums like he was possessed, but alcohol was the real demon running the show. His drinking wasn't just a problem, it was a ticking time bomb. He could barely function, barely stand, barely get through a show without falling apart. Led Zeppelin tried to hold him together, but no one could save him from himself. In 1980, after downing an obscene amount of vodka, he passed out and choked on his own vomit in his sleep. Just like that, one of the greatest drummers of all time was gone. Led Zeppelin refused to continue without him, proving that even rock's biggest titans weren't immune to addiction's destruction. He had talent beyond measure, but addiction doesn't care about talent. It takes what it wants, and Bonham was just another name on its endless list. His downfall was as dramatic as his playing, loud, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. D.D. Ramone didn't just live punk rock, he was punk rock. And like many before him, he burned out fast. Illegal substances were his constant companion, running through his veins like gasoline fueling a fire. His music screamed his pain, his lyrics spelling out the battle he fought every single day. Sobriety was always just out of reach. He tried, he failed, and then he tried again. But in 2002, the fight ended. An overdose silenced one of punk's most iconic voices, proving once again that the rock star lifestyle chews people up and spits them out without a second thought. His music lives on, but the man himself became just another cautionary tale in a world that never learns. Every line he wrote hinted at the darkness that followed him, and in the end, that darkness won. 21. Bon Scott. Bon Scott was AC/DC's wild heart and soul, a powerhouse of a frontman with a voice that could shake the ground. But his drinking? That was next-level destructive. Booze was his best friend and his worst enemy, fueling his reckless energy on stage while slowly ruining him behind the scenes. His bandmates knew the dangers, but how do you stop a rock star from living like a rock star? In 1980, after another night of heavy drinking, he passed out in a car and never woke up. Choking on his own vomit, he became yet another rock casualty. AC/DC moved on, but the hole he left behind was impossible to ignore. His death wasn't just tragic, it was inevitable. He drank hard, he sang harder, but no one can outrun what was always coming. 22. Lemmy Kilmister. Lemmy Kilmister lived like a storm that never calmed down. He poured whiskey like it was the only thing keeping him going, ran on a steady diet of amphetamines, and somehow managed to keep playing, keep screaming, keep living while others around him burned out. Motorhead didn't just exist because of him, it thrived on his raw, reckless energy. But even a train going full speed eventually runs out of track. For years, it looked like nothing could touch him. Decades of bad habits, non-stop partying, and loud music never slowed him down. Then reality hit. In 2015, he found out he had cancer. Just days later, he was gone. That's how fast it all ended. People love to remember Lemmy as a rock god, the guy with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other, laughing in the face of death. But the truth? No one wins that game forever. His body finally gave out, crushed under the weight of everything he threw at it. He went hard, but time doesn't care how legendary you are. When it comes for you, it doesn't knock, it kicks the door down. 23. Shannon Hoon. Shannon Hoon had a voice that could shake you awake, but even he couldn't outrun his own demons. Blind Melon shot to fame in the 90s, riding high on success. But fame doesn't fix everything, and it sure doesn't heal a broken person. His bandmates saw what was happening, but watching someone spiral is one thing, stopping them is another. The signs were there, clear as day, but the train kept speeding forward. Then, in 1995, it all crashed. Shannon overdosed right in the middle of a tour. He was 28. One second he was here, the next he wasn't. Just like that, another star burned out too soon. Blind Melon's rise came to a sudden halt. Fans were left with nothing but old songs and the question of what could have been. It's the same sad song played on repeat. Another talent gone too soon, another life lost to the same story. It's been told 100 times, and yet no one ever changes the ending. 24. Paul Gray. Paul Gray wasn't just the bassist of Slipknot, he was the soul of the band. On stage, he was unstoppable, pouring every ounce of himself into the music, making the crowd feel something raw and real. But when the lights faded and the music stopped, he was fighting a battle that no one else could fight for him. Addiction had wrapped around him like a shadow, creeping into every part of his life. Illegal substances had its grip on him, and no matter how much success he found, it never loosened. His bandmates saw the signs, and they worried. His friends tried to help, to remind him that he wasn't alone, but addiction doesn't listen to reason. It doesn't care about love, or friendship, or talent. It only pulls, drags, and takes. By 2010, the weight of it all had become too much. Paul was found in a hotel room, gone too soon, lost to an overdose. It was the news no one wanted to hear, but deep down, some had feared it for a long time. Slipknot, The band that had built something incredible together would never be the same. The grief hit hard, shaking the entire music world. Fans mourned, his bandmates carried the loss with them, and his family was left with an empty space that could never be filled. His death became another painful reminder that addiction doesn't care who you are. It doesn't matter how talented you are, how many people love you, or how much you try to fight. It can take even the strongest. His bandmates had seen the struggle, but seeing isn't enough when addiction has already dug in deep. They played on, carrying his memory with them, but Slipknot would never truly heal from losing Paul. His music lives on, but so does the ache of what was lost. 25. Chris Cornell. Chris Cornell had one of the most unforgettable voices in rock. It was powerful, filled with emotion, capable of shaking the earth and touching hearts all at once. He had built a legacy, fronting Soundgarden, then Audioslave, leaving his mark on generations of rock fans. But even with all that success, something dark followed him. He struggled with addiction. He battled depression. He spoke about it openly, hoping that honesty could keep the demons at bay. For years, he fought hard to stay sober, to stay in control. But mental health struggles don't just disappear. They linger in the background, waiting for a weak moment. No matter how much he had accomplished, no matter how much love he had around him, that battle was never truly over. In 2017, after years of highs and lows, the news no one wanted to believe came out. Chris Cornell had died. He was found in his hotel room, his life cut short. Prescription substances played a role, but the pain had started long before that night. Depression had been there for years, pulling at him, refusing to let go. The world lost not just a musician, but a voice that had meant so much to so many people.